Okay, good morning, everybody. We're beginning our next class on Capuchin history. This is class number 10. We've been going through the Capuchin reform carefully. In our last class, we went over the generalate of Bernardino of Ochino, his great fall from grace, how he left Italy, he left the Capuchins, he left the church, and he left the Capuchins in a complete and total mess. And the Capuchins were almost suppressed. There's one of the stories that while they were waiting to see the Pope before they had that meeting where Francesco de Jesi stood up and said that God didn't suppress the Apostolic College because of Judas, when they were told to be quiet. Before that meeting, when they were actually saved, a visitator was sent to the Capuchin friary to see the friars. And it was the Vigil of the Immaculate Conception on December 7th. And all the friars were kneeling down, eating their meal in penance in honor of Our Lady. And so the visitator, the cardinal, said, well, if they honor Our Lady like this, they can't be heretics. So that was something that did help them. If it wasn't for that honor that they had to Our Lady, the order probably would not have been spared. And so they were in the mode of recovery now, right? We saw that Francesco de Jesi was elected the superior of the community, the vicar general. Again, they're still under the conventuals, so I keep using the word general, but they were vicar generals because they were underneath the conventual generals still. They didn't have their full autonomy. That was kind of like, basically on paper, they really did live autonomously from the conventuals, but they were technically underneath the conventuals, okay? So Francesco de Jesi really held things together during that time of crisis. So again, he was appointed and then he was elected by the next chapter, and he was the guy who was holding things together. He had a real deep spirituality, a real sense of the Capuchin life, or I should say the early Franciscan life. He really knew Francis well from the interior. And one time when he was praying in a friary, several friars saw St. Francis standing above Francesco de Jesi. And they heard St. Francis say to Francesco de Jesi, Francesco, receive the staff and go forth and strengthen your brethren. Receive the staff and go forth and strengthen your brethren. And so he did. So, and then one time when he was visiting another friar, he was praying and light emanated from him. And so we see that beautiful confirmation of God upon him, the confirmation of God's grace, that he was the man to lead this reform, and this reform is going to persevere under his leadership, even though they have undergone such horrible, horrible crises. So in his visitations, he went to the Venetian province where Ochino had done most of his preaching, and he brought all the Bernardino of Ochinos into repentance and brought them to a deeper understanding of the faith. And he corrected all the Bernardino of Ochino's false teachings. And Francesco de Jesi was such a well-respected man of holiness and very articulate that he was able to bring all of those who are following Bernardino of Ochino's false doctrines back into the full light of grace. Okay? And he assured, when he traveled about from province to province, he assured all the brothers of the stability of the order, not to be afraid, the order will persevere. And just to kind of show to everybody else, to the whole world, that the Capuchins were there to stay, he decided to have this event where he gathered with over 200 friars in Assisi to make a little bit of a show to say, we're still standing after that last persecution. We're still here. It's an interesting little story about a friar from Venice, a Venetian friar, who came to see Francesco de Jesi. He was an old friend of Francesco de Jesi when he was in the observance. And this other Francesco from the Venetian province was doing a little bit of reform movement from within the order. And he kept encouraging Francesco de Jesi to bring all the Capuchins back under the observance and be part of this reformati. But he would have none of it. He wouldn't hear of it, Francesco de Jesi. He answered his friend kindly and courteously. And his friend was like, well, listen, I'll get a papal bull. It'll protect us if I get a bull. And then with that papal bull, we'll be able to live the life and blah, 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 blah. Francesco de Jesi would have none of it. What he said to his friend was this. He said, frate mio, my brother, you may get a bull from heaven, but that will not make a true reform. It is not the bull, but the life which makes the reform. That being so, One had but to look at the life led by this poor Capuchin congregation to see that in all the marks of the perfect reform they had both long desired and indeed, if you want to know whether the Capuchin congregation is a true reform, nay, the perfect and ultimate reform, see how exactly it answers to the prophecies of holy men who since the days of St. Francis have predicted the perfect reform which would renew the order in the spirit of St. Francis himself and of his first brethren. So that was kind of his response. So listen, you get all the bulls you want from the Pope, but that's not going to make it a reform. Look at how the Capuchins live. And Francesco challenged him to look at the life of the friars, the organization, the order, to see how they live a life of such strong prayer, of penance, of great poverty, to see that they follow the rules strictly and carefully. He says that's enough. That's what makes a reform. Not a bull, not a paperwork, but the life being lived in the manner in which St. Francis gave it, living the rule strictly and faithfully. And even says this was prophesied, and it was prophesied, that there would be this perfect reform movement. So Francesco de Jesi strongly held to the, we're sticking to our guns, this community will persevere. So the years 1547 to 1562 are considered the years of recovery, the years that they were recovering from Ochino, leaving from all the persecutions. So they held the general chapter in 1547, and Francesco de Jesi, he was just too sick to attend. He was old now, decrepit. He just couldn't continue. In the meantime, we had saw in the past how Bernardino of Asti, his health had failed, but he recovered well. And so the general chapter in 1547 elected Bernardino of Asti again as the minister general, or the vicar general of the community. He wasn't even present at the chapter when they elected him. He was at the Council of Trent, participating in a discussion among the friars of which order should hold the seals. And so he was on official business at the Council of Trent when he was elected vicar general of the order. And so in 1548, a year after he assumes his position, Bernardino of Asti takes pen to paper and writes a beautiful letter to the brethren. And I want to read the whole letter to you, so ask your patience, and just to listen to the heart of Bernardino of Asti, to listen to what he has to say about the beauty of the Capuchin reform and about their life. And also about the warnings about how easy it is to fall away from the life and for the reform to fail. He wrote, Reverend fathers and brothers and sons, salutations. Rejoice always in the Lord. Again I say, rejoice. The Lord is nigh and has a continual care for us. As precious garments adorn the body and make it to become more beautiful than it was, so are the holy virtues, the precious garments and adornment of the soul. In truth, they make it more beautiful and bring it to such dignity and high station that the sinful and adulterous soul, the slave of the devil, is made the spouse of the Most High Emperor, our God, the Lord Jesus Christ, and the Queen and Empress of the heavenly kingdom and empire, of which virtues the most worthy and the chief is charity and love. A virtue worldly and animal men feign to be clothed with charity, but from such we must guard ourselves and flee, as our good master admonishes us, saying that by their fruits, that is their works, you shall know them. I would therefore give you 2 examples and signs by which to know in yourselves and in others true charity. When you see a Capuchin friar continually solicitous for prayer and a real zealot for holy poverty, when you see such a one charitable towards his spiritual brethren and our other neighbors, believe that in him is true charity. But if you see one who is negligent in prayer and who takes pleasure in a comfortable life and an abundance of sensual comforts, and who yet preaches and belauds charity, fly from him and hold him suspect. Believe not that his charity is a true charity, but more likely carnality, or a love of carnal and sensual, since charity cannot abide in us without other virtues, particularly and of necessity, prayer and poverty. And if you see a Capuchin friar who is not observant, nay, who is not zealous for the full observance of most holy poverty, hold in suspicion his prayer. For we have known certain friars in zeal for poverty, For we have known certain friars in whom there appeared a certain zeal for poverty, and afterwards they repented and returned to a comfortable life, whom indeed is not for us to judge, but I believe the chief cause of their ruin to have been their lack of humble prayer. Certain it is that as a house cannot stand which lacks foundations, so with us. If we fail fully to observe most holy poverty, God will permit our congregation to come to ruin. Woe to those Capuchin friars who seek to relax the poverty of our life. In truth, they are not friars minor of St. Francis, but of the kin of Brother Elias. And as the apostle says, enemies of the cross of Christ, our God, and destroyers of our congregation. Earnestly then do I exhort and pray each one of you, in so far as you can, to give yourselves diligently to humble and devout prayer, and that you beseech from your heart the Lord to give and increase and conserve in you the holy virtues, especially most holy charity and poverty, which with prayer are the most necessary and precious adornment of a true friar minor, without which no Capuchin friar can be pleasing to God, nor hope to enter into the everlasting nuptials of the divine and heavenly bridegroom. How beautiful, huh? Talk about somebody who really understands the heart of Francis. Francis could have written that letter himself. So beautifully he speaks about the primacy of prayer, the primacy of poverty that must have the expression of charity. If you see prayer and poverty without charity, If you see poverty without prayer, it's those three real foundation pillars of the life of prayer, poverty, and charity. Charity always being the queen virtue of all. All is to lead to charity, right? So that's some of the words of encouragement that he gave to the brothers in 1548 when he wrote them that letter. And if you want to see how the friars lived, and if you get the book, The Capuchins, Volume 1, pages 150 to 156, really give a good feel of the early life of the Capuchin friars and what the life was actually like. And he also has a great writing about the preaching friars on pages 156 to 164. Fantastic, fantastic read on that. Now, 3 years later, they have the general chapter of 1550. And again, Bernardino of Asti was elected vicar general. This is why we say Asti was more of the spiritual father to the reform. He wrote the constitutions of 1536. He was minister general at least 3 times elected, held the order together during those days, early days. Just amazing, this man. There's a beautiful book here on the essays on the Capuchin reform, this one here, and the 150th anniversary. And there's a great, great chapter on Bernardino of Asti. And I'll give you a good feel for who this man really is, his spirituality and so forth. Also in the book, The Capuchin Reform of Franciscan Renaissance, by Paul Hambridge, edited by Paul Hambridge about the early days. A lot of great information there too on Bernardino of Asti. We could probably just do a whole class on Bernardino of Asti himself. So in 1550, the general chapter enacted some new laws. And it says that no minister should be elected guardian of a friary unless you have been in the reform for 5 years. So you can no longer be a superior unless you were 5 years in the reform. So if you transferred in, you got to wait 5 years before you can be a guardian of a house. And the purpose of that was to protect the life, so that you would have somebody who was formed in the life then leading the life, even if they transferred in from another religious community. And said no one should be received as clerics unless they received formal training. So again, implementing those formation programs that were being discussed at the Council of Trent. So the order began to grow again. And in receiving vocations, Bernardino of Asti had this to say. He said, "Let us not be anxious to increase in numbers, for where there are many, contrary opinions are multiplied, and it is easier to agree with the few than the many. Moreover, the grace God has given us of keeping strict observance is a special individual favor granted to us in these our times, which yet was denied so many holy men who with tears besought it of the divine goodness in the past. God willed it to be plainly seen that this was his work, and that no man should take the credit to himself, for those who did he sent away." And so we see him talking about the necessity that in accepting men that they truly want to live the life, they're well formed in the life, and not just to take everybody, but to be carefully examining of those who are sent to the order. So we go now to the general chapter of 1552, and there are certain decrees that are given in this general chapter. Now remember, the Council of Trent is going on, and so there's decrees coming from Trent and so forth. So there's some tweaking to rules and then tweaking to the constitutions as well. Just tweaking. If you want to read the various constitutions translations, you can go to capdocs.com, and you can see Father Paul Hambridge, translated all the various Capuchin constitutions that over the years. And again, it's the same constitutions with minor changes one to the next. Okay, minor changes just for the necessity they changed. So in the decrees of this chapter, it said that no recourse to money except for absolute necessities of life, and then only when it could not be procured through begging. So they're not using money, and if you're going to get somebody to buy something for you, you had to make sure that it had to be absolute necessity. No sellable goods are to be received for the purpose of procuring meat. No friars except the ill were permitted to the use of a pillow of straw, still less wool. So think about that. You were not allowed, except if you were sick, to have a pillow of straw. Never mind a pillow made of wool. Mantles were not to extend beyond the fingertips. So the capes that you wear with the cold, it's supposed to come down to here. Most of them have to the floor and so forth. Capuchins to the fingertips, in the same way Francis wore them. Guardians were to correct officials of the community who were negligent in their duties. And the friars were forbidden to act as physicians to the laity. I guess if you had somebody come in who was a doctor or nurse, they weren't allowed to serve the laity as a doctor or a nurse. Now, at this chapter, Eusebius of Ancona was elected vicar general. Again, another holy man. We have Bernardino of Ochino stepped down, and now we have stepping up Eusebius of Ancona. And he was the elected vicar general. In the book, The Capuchin Chronicle, there's about 4 pages of Eusebius of Ancona's generalate. Fantastic read about his life. It's short, but it gives you a good sense of just the virtuousness of the man. He was virtuous, he was devout, he had a way of explaining the rule that just kept out all relaxations, and he was considered equal to Bernardino of Ochino. And so he was really looked upon as kind of another one of those strong men who are going to lead the reform and keep it faithful. The revision of the 1536 constitutions were the works of Angelo of Savano, and they remained essentially the same. And some thought that the new constitutions were commonplace and incorrect. There were certain omissions in the redraft. For example, the renunciation of the exemption from the diocesan bishop, the obligation of superiors to hand over friaries and belongings to the benefactors each year, begging on behalf of the poor in times of shortage, duty of nursing the plague victims, exhortation into the text. So some of the wordings were changed because it was repetitious. So there was kind of a reaction to some of those changes that were made by Angelo da Savano. But again, it was restored. So many observants passed over to the Capuchins again. So some found it too austere and passed back over to the observance. So there was a sense of like, okay, the Capuchin reform seems to have proved itself. We're now 20 years after the whole thing with Ochino. I'm joining the Capuchins, right? Then they get there, it's like, I wasn't expecting this, right? Because they're sleeping on boards. They don't have straw pillows. They don't even have blankets yet. It was Eusebius of Ancona who introduced the blankets. They're begging for their food. They only keep a 3 to 5 day, at most 1 week supply of food in the house. There's readings at tables. They're living very austerely. It's very silent within the friary. They're only talking when necessary, just as St. Francis said it should be when he established the friary of the Portiuncula. And so they're really living the radical poverty. They're going barefoot. The only ones wearing sandals were those who had to because of sickness or because of really bad inclement weather. You know, they're getting up at vigils at midnight. They're praying all the hours of the office in common. They're chanting a recto tono. There's 2 hours of silence during the day before the tabernacle in community. And some guys found that really hard, really, really hard. So the observants who joined him fled back. So Pope Julius III in 1551 issued a papal bull renewing the edicts of Paul III, and it put a stop to many observant friars from joining the Capuchins. And it caused a new generation of Capuchins to spring up. those who had never been part of the observance. So new members no longer consider themselves observant reformers. So this is an important moment in history. So in 1551, what you have is these observants join, then they go back. Then the Pope puts out this bull in 1551 saying, okay, no more transferring. So what happened was the guys who were entering now were new novices, young men who were not former friars of another community. They were being formed by the Capuchins as Capuchins. And as this generation grew up, they no longer saw themselves as former observants who were forming a reform, but they saw themselves as Capuchins, as their own reform movement. And this was crucial to the life of the Capuchins, is that they didn't see themselves no longer as a breakaway, but saw themselves now as a new flourishing branch of the order. Very significant moment. So then we had a general chapter in 1555, and Eusebius was reelected, and he had another great crisis to face. So the crises are never over. The order will always have enemies, even those who think they're doing things in goodwill. You get people, whether they be popes, bishops, chancery workers, lay faithful, there's always those who will be instigated by the evil one to try to destroy the order. Even if they have good intention, the evil one instigating them does not have good intention. And so it brings about a lot of destruction. So this time the fight was against union with the conventuals. The conventual friars had become lax and demoralized. So before becoming Pope Paul IV, he urged either reform or he urged either the reform of the conventuals or the suppression of the conventuals. He told them reform or else. So Pope Paul IV, with an eye to reforming the conventuals, proposed a union with the Capuchins. And the Capuchins were not in favor of this one. They did not want their order to be relaxed. They didn't want their observance to be mitigated. So Eusebius refused to leave Rome in case an agreement was made without his concession. So he hung in tight there. Another complication came when two conventual reforms sprung up. One founded in Sicily, the other in Spain. The one in Spain was later known as the Alcantarini, Peter of Alcantara. Both communities had assumed the name and the habit of the Capuchins without the connection. They were separate jurisdictions, but they were assuming the name Capuchin, one in Sicily and the other in Spain under Peter of Alcantara. So then came the general chapter of 1558. By the way, they didn't have the union, by the way, so that union never happened, thanks be to God. It would have ruined the Capuchin reform. So the general chapter 1558 elected Tommaso di Città di Castello, and he was the first general to have done all his formation as a Capuchin. He was never a former observant, never a former conventual. He grew up basically as a Capuchin, and now he's Minister General. And he protested against this union. And so Pope Paul IV issued in 1559 a papal bull, which was obtained by Tommaso di Città di Castello, and it confirmed the privileges to the Capuchins made by Pope Clement VII and Paul III. All other reforms were forbidden to wear the Capuchin habit or use the Capuchin name. This is considered the Bull of Independence. The Bull of Independence. Paul IV, 1559. 1559. So that ended that whole controversy. So now, let's go over to the Council of Trent, 1562, 3 years after that bull. The Council of Trent is still going on. And Tommaso is there. And for the first time, the Capuchins were invited to take their place among the generals of the Mendicant orders. So the general of the Capuchins was invited to sit next to the general of the conventuals and the general of the observance, basically recognizing that he is a legitimate superior of an order. The following year, 1563, there was a discussion on religious life, and all mendicant orders were granted the right to own their own property, including the conventuals. However, the Capuchins and the observant friars were exempt. They were exempt from that. So, thanks be to God that Tommaso was there and able to say, whoa. No. We don't want any exemptions to own property. That's part of our life. Don't ruin our reform, please. And so they got their way. But the observants also got it. So you see there was still a movement among the observants to go to that deeper sense of reform. And so we're going to continue on in our next class. I don't want to go into it right now. We're going to talk about the Capuchin development. We're going to cover a good 200 years in our next class. We're going to go from 1562 to 1761. Pretty much the big fights are over now. Tommaso had that last fight along with Eusebius to try to stop any kind of union with the conventuals. And so they won that fight, and that kind of ends the exterior persecutions on the Capuchins. So now they've kind of just settled. They're relaxed now. They went through the whole trials of getting started. Then they went through the difficulties of the chapters of 1535, 1536, Ludovico starting his problems. Then they went through all the trials with Bernardino of Ochino and almost getting suppressed. And then they had a little fight there, but now it's like at rest. The order's at rest. You have all these houses all over. You're talking now well over 15,000 friars just within the boot of Italy. And they're living the life. There's a Capuchin friary everywhere throughout Italy because they can't expand outside the Alps. And so you have these houses of 8 to 12 guys living the life, living the rule of Francis rigorously with a great uniformity. One house to the next is very much the same. It's not one way in this house, one way in that house. No, every house, the order of the house, the discipline of the house is there. A life of prayer, penance, poverty, minority, fraternity, and the apostolic work. But it's important to note the apostolic work was not the primary principle of the life. It was not about going and working with the poor. It was not about going out and preaching. The life was about living the gospel just as it was with St. Francis. A life of prayer, penance, poverty, minority, fraternity. The apostolate was always done in the context of that or underneath that. So because their apostolate was backed by such a life of prayer, such a life of penance, by the guys immersing themselves in prayer and penance and in fraternity, that when they went out to do ministry, in the short periods of time they would go out to do ministry, it was far more impactful because not of their own efforts or their own strengths or their own gifts or talents, but because of the graces that were obtained for the souls for whom they were serving through that life of prayer, penance, poverty, minority. Their apostolate was empowered by their union with God. Not that they were doing apostolic work so that they can be more powerful, not they were living a life of prayer so that they can be more powerful than an apostolate, but they were praying and doing penance for deeper union with God and reparation for their own sins, reparation of other sins. But it was from that intimate union with God that had the secondary effect of the power within the context of the apostolate. They were able to radiate the light of Christ in the apostolate because they were coming into deeper union with God through that life of prayer. Again, praying the divine office 8 hours a day, praying the little office of the Blessed Mother or the Rosary in common, the silence that they held where they could recollect about God, studying the scriptures, the fathers of the church, readings at meals, 2 hours of mental prayer every day in community. Recipe for holiness of life and for positively instituting the life given to them by St. Francis, making it livable for everyone who had the interior resolve to give themselves completely, unreservedly, limitlessly to Christ Jesus. All right, we're going to pick up the next class on Capuchin development, covering those years 1562 to 1761. All right, may Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.